Okay, let's unpack this. You've given us a really interesting stack of sources, all circling around, well, a pretty fundamental question, actually.
Hmm.
What happens to human behavior specifically? Our politeness, our norms, our civility when things get stressful, maybe even collapse a little?
Yeah, when the pressure's really on.
Exactly. So this deep dive is for you, the listener, to help you quickly grasp the key ideas from these sources on what civilization is, what civility means, and whether it's, a deep-rooted foundation or just maybe a fragile surface layer that cracks pretty easily.
Right. Does it hold up?
We'll look at how thinkers have grappled with these ideas and then examine some real-world stress tests, including, of course, the recent pandemic.
And what's fascinating from the jump looking at these sources is that the very concept of civilization, well, it's more layered than it first seems.
Okay.
The sources start with the most basic idea. Civilization as like a complex society. We're talking urban life, formal governance, social structures, things like writing.
The infrastructure bit.
Pretty much. It's rooted in the Latin word civitas, meaning city, which kind of highlights that concentration of people.
Right, so it starts with cities and systems, but the sources quickly show it's not just about structures, is it? There's this whole other layer tied to civility.
Exactly. Politeness, good manners,
Courteous behavior, yeah.
and that word civility, it shares the same Latin root. The sources point to how its meaning evolved over time.
How so?
Well, thinkers like Norbert Elias studied this evolution, detailing what he called the civilizing process. It's basically how European societies gradually developed these more refined manners and codes of etiquette over centuries.
Oh, right, like the example of table manners?
That's a classic one he used, yeah. It's all about increased self-restraint becoming, the expected social behavior.
So society gets more complex, more organized, and alongside that, our personal conduct is expected to become more refined, controlled.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
But the sources reveal this idea went even further. It didn't just stop at manners, it moved into ethics.
Ah, okay. The idea that civilization should include actual moral progress.
Yes, absolutely. Philosophers started arguing that true civilization isn't just having impressive buildings and complex systems. It's also about ethical development.
Making us better people, sort of.
In a way.
Yeah.
Albert Schweitzer, for instance, he made this key distinction between just material advancement and what he called ethical civilization, the collective progress towards improving individuals spiritually and morally.
So justice, altruism, enlightenment even.
Exactly. In this view, those things aren't just nice side effects of civilization. They are part of what it actually means to be civilized.
That sounds like a pretty high bar to clear. But what about the flip side the sources explore? The idea that maybe civilization, with all its rules and restraints, maybe it isn't entirely positive.
And this is where the philosophical tension really emerges. Some thinkers definitely questioned if civilization was a pure good.
Like Rousseau.
Rousseau, yeah, for instance. He argued that it actually corrupted what he saw as natural human goodness, introducing inequality and, well, problems. He saw society as conflicting with a more natural, maybe purer state.
And Nietzsche later had concerns too, right? Seeing norms as potentially repressive.
He did. That civilized norms could stifle something vital in humans.
Okay, so if it's potentially corrupting or repressive, why do we build it? Why maintain it? What's the argument for civilization as a necessary structure, even with those downsides the sources mentioned?
Well, that's where thinkers like Thomas Hobbes provide a really stark counterpoint, as the sources note.
The state of nature.
Exactly.
Right.
Hobbes looked at what life might be like without civilization, and his description was famous for a reason: a war of every man against every man.
Life being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Chilling.
Totally. So his argument in Leviathan is essentially that social order, civilization, is this vital protective structure. It prevents that chaos by restraining our potentially destructive impulses.
And that feels like a pretty direct line to Freud, doesn't it? In Civilization and its discontents. The sources mention his view
How different.
that civilization imposes rules against our primal urges, which causes discontent. But he really zeroes in on aggression, specifically.
He really does. Freud brings in that powerful, unsettling idea of a human desire for aggression. He even quotes that Latin phrase, homo homini lupus, man is wolf to man.
Wow.
His argument is that laws and societal norms are necessary precisely because they have to keep this fundamental hostility in check. And his assessment is quite stark.
Mm-hmm.
He felt that Civilized society is perpetually menaced with disintegration through this primary hostility.
So that's where that idea really comes from. Civilization is just a thin veneer covering something darker, something always threatening to break through.
That's a key place. It takes root in these sources, yeah.
And look, we can't really talk about the ideal of being civilized without acknowledging how that term itself has been, well, misused, right? The sources mention critiques tied to power and history.
Oh, absolutely crucial point. The sources highlight how colonial powers, historically, weaponized the whole concept of civilization.
How so?
They used it to justify dominating other peoples, labeling them uncivilized or barbaric as a pretext. Eurocentric ideals were often imposed, sometimes violently, creating this false hierarchy and completely ignoring the value and complexity of other cultures.
Right, a tool of oppression.
Definitely. And even more recently, the sources include critiques that question the entire project of civilization itself. You mentioned Rand prior.
Yeah, arguing it might just be a brief failed experiment.
It's a provocative thought. He points out that humans spent, the vast majority of our history in foraging societies, much smaller groups. And civilization's relatively short run, in his view, has been marked by massive environmental destruction and social alienation. It really challenges that simple narrative of linear progress.
So, okay, summing up this first part then. The sources show civilization is way more complicated than just, cities and laws. It's about complex societies, sure, but it carries all this baggage about civility as manners and this higher ideal of ethical progress.
Right.
And crucially, there's this deep tension. Is it necessary order keeping chaos at bay? Or is it potentially repressive, even destructive?
Yeah.
And that idea that it might just be a thin veneer, it's definitely in the mix.
And that foundational tension, that thin veneer question, is exactly what the next section really digs into. If civilization involves these norms, these restraints, what happens when they're put under extreme pressure? Does that veneer just crack wide open?
Right. This is where the sources bring in the real-world examples. And maybe one of the most bizarre but also telling from recent memory is that panic buying at the start of COVID, specifically the toilet paper.
Oh, the toilet paper. It's almost comical looking back, but it was profoundly illustrative, wasn't it?
Totally weird.
Normally, we have this sort of implicit social contract about sharing resources, not grabbing everything. But the fear of shortage,
Right.
amplified by seeing other people starting to hoard, it created a classic tragedy of the commons.
Everyone acting in their own perceived self-interest makes it worse for everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Individuals acted selfishly out of fear, and collectively, that self-interest created and absolutely worsened the shortage. As Stephen Drgodos points out in the sources, seeing others stockpile makes people feel like they'll be taken advantage of if they don't join in.
Right, the FOMO effect, but for essentials.
Kind of.
Yeah.
The scarcity mindset kicked in hard. A hint of shortage suddenly made toilet paper seem incredibly valuable, driving this massive overpurchasing of, yes, toilet paper of all things. It was just a stark example of how fear can quickly override civility and any sense of equitable behavior.
And it wasn't just about products on shelves, was it? The pandemic also triggered some really intense social conflict, particularly over masks. Something seemingly simple, covering your face, became incredibly charged.
A total lightning rod. The sources note how a mask, originally intended as this neutral piece of protective gear, just quickly became inflammatory.
Why, though?
Because of what it started to symbolize in a really polarized environment. For some people, refusing a mask was about asserting personal freedom or maybe showing political loyalty. For others, wearing one signaled trust in science or community care or just compliance with rules.
So both sides saw the other as violating something fundamental.
Exactly, fundamental values, which in their eyes seemed to justify anger, hostility, even aggression. We saw those disturbing examples mentioned in the sources. Retail workers facing assaults, verbal abuse everywhere.
That awful incident of the man wiping his nose on someone's shirt.
Yeah, truly shocking. And even, tragically, a murder linked to a masks dispute. It just showed how stress can harden people into these rigid moral frameworks, where civility only gets extended to those inside your perceived in-group.
Though it's important, and the sources do note this, there were also those counterexamples of extraordinary kindness during that time. People sewing masks for strangers, neighbors delivering groceries. It wasn't all conflict.
Absolutely crucial point, and we'll definitely get back to that resilience. But even in less extreme scenarios than a full-blown pandemic, the sources show civility can fray pretty easily.
Yeah.
Thinking about consumer frenzy, like Black Friday sales.
Ah, yes, an annual self-inflicted test of civility.
Precisely. Normally, shopping involves basic norms. You queue up, you're generally polite. But the sources point to the manic nature of Black Friday.
What drives that?
Well, you've got huge discounts on very limited items, creating this intense demand-scarcity imbalance. Then add massive crowds. People are often sleep-deprived, nerves are frayed. While crowds aren't inherently bad, these specific conditions create enormous pressure.
Like a perfect storm for bad behavior.
Kind of. As the retail research mentioned shows, when people feel thwarted, like they're just about to get that deal and someone cuts in or the item runs out, it can feel like a personal injustice. That feeling can provoke lashing out.
Retail rage.
Exactly. It's described as temporary normlessness or retail rage, where those competitive, acquisitive impulses just override polite behavior because of the intense pressure. It really highlights how thin that line can be when those instincts are deliberately provoked by the situation.
Okay, and then you have the gravest tests mentioned in the sources, actual disasters. The common narrative, the movie version, is often instant panic, looting, every man for himself. But the sources suggest a much more complex picture.
They really challenge that common assumption, yeah. Comparing historical events like the Titanic and the Lusitania sinkings is incredibly insightful here, as the sources point out. It really shows the crucial factor of time. Well, the Titanic took over 2.5 hours to sink. It's a relatively long time in a disaster. There was time for existing social patterns, existing norms to kind of reemerge after the initial shock.
So good manners had a chance, as one source puts it.
That's the idea. The women and children first protocol, while not perfectly followed, was largely attempted. And social status, first class versus third, definitely played a role in who survived. But compare that to the Lusitania.
Much faster, right?
Went down in just 18 minutes. Utter chaos. The sources say the immediate flight impulse dominated. Pure survival instincts kicked in. In that scenario, it was the young and the strong who had a stark advantage. That social norm of women and children first largely evaporated in the immediate scramble.
So the initial shock, the immediate crisis, might strip away that veneer. But if there's even a brief pause, a chance to think, social norms can reassert themselves? Is that the idea?
That seems to be the implication from comparing those two. The initial adrenaline-fueled panic phase. It's actually pretty short. If there's any time for reflection, for collective action, or just for ingrained patterns to resurface, then higher-order values and existing social structures can reappear.
And this ties right into the counter-evidence you mentioned earlier, the fact that disasters often showcase incredible altruism and solidarity, not just breakdown and panic.
Exactly. The sources really highlight studies, like Rebecca Solnit's work, which show that in the aftermath of earthquakes, hurricanes, bombings, citizens are often frequently selfless. It's quite remarkable.
How does that manifest?
They form ad hoc teams spontaneously, rescuing strangers from rubble, sharing scarce supplies, cooperating to solve immediate problems. A real community of survivors emerges. It's a powerful counter-narrative to the assumed dog-eat-dog scenario.
And sometimes the sources suggest it's actually the authorities who panic more, imposing harsh measures that might even undermine that natural, organic solidarity that emerges.
It's a fascinating and quite challenging point in the research. It pushes back very strongly against that simple thin veneer theory. It suggests that maybe mutual aid, cooperation, maybe that's actually a more default human response in crisis than we often assume, especially right after the event.
An evolutionary strategy.
Anthropologists certainly point to cooperation as a deep-seated evolutionary survival strategy. So this evidence suggests that civilized behavior, or maybe more accurately, pro-social behavior, it's highly context-dependent. The very same person can be selfish in one moment and altruistic in the next.
Depending on.
Well, key factors seem to be the speed of the crisis onset, the perceived scarcity, which isn't always the same as actual scarcity, the presence or absence of clear social leadership, and critically, the level of pre-existing trust within that community.
Okay, let's really home in on the COVID-19 pandemic again then, because it wasn't just one quick event, was it? It was this prolonged, widespread test. Years where just being near other people felt risky. It fundamentally altered daily interactions globally. It really was like a massive, unplanned experiment on civility.
Yeah, a huge experiment. And it forced immediate, sometimes awkward changes in how we interacted. Wearing masks, for instance, especially initially it hid faces. That impairs all the subtle communication we rely on. Reading emotions, building trust, showing empathy.
Right, you couldn't see smiles.
Exactly. People had to adapt, relying more on tone of voice, maybe exaggerating gestures, explicitly stating feelings, shouting, "I'm happy to see you," from 6 feet away. Interactions often felt more guarded, definitely less personal. Patients in healthcare settings reported feeling less supported sometimes.
Well, people did adapt, right? The whole smizing thing, smiling with your eyes.
People did adapt, yeah.
Ah.
And maybe a small benefit was it forced us to listen more carefully to the actual words people used. But studies did note that masks could reduce perceived trust in some interactions. And there were cultural differences too. Of course, mask wearing was already more common in parts of East Asia than in the West.
And the physical rituals, handshakes, hugs, those European cheek kisses overnight, they became taboo, potentially dangerous.
A complete and sudden disruption. The sources note how quickly greetings changed. We all did that awkward dance of waves, nods, maybe the elbow bump.
Yeah, the elbow bump.
It really highlighted how deeply ingrained those physical rituals were and how much we actually felt their absence. There was a sense of loss, definitely discomfort. But again, it also showed how adaptable norms can be. The handshake, centuries old, was just suspended. New etiquette emerged, like simply saying nice to meet you without any touch becoming perfectly acceptable.
And personal space just ballooned 2 meters, 6 feet deep.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a suggestion. You had markers on floors everywhere. Physical closeness, which usually signals warmth or trust, got completely reframed as a potential threat.
It did. Although one potentially positive lasting shift mentioned in the sources is maybe a greater consciousness around consent and physical touch. It seems more common now to explicitly ask, are you hugging? Or is a handshake okay? Before initiating contact. So even sudden disruptions can lead us to reevaluate ingrained habits in potentially beneficial ways.
Moving beyond the physical side, the pandemic really put trust and social cohesion through the ringer, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Severely tested. Initially, remember, there was often that powerful, all in this together feeling.
Clapping for healthcare workers.
Exactly. Community support groups popping up, gestures of appreciation. That showed a high level of trust, or at least solidarity, when facing a common threat. But as the pandemic dragged on, things got more complicated. Misinformation started spreading like wildfire. Policies sometimes seemed inconsistent or confusing.
And trust started to fray.
Definitely. Cynicism grew. Compliance with public health measures, masks, lockdowns, eventually vaccines seemed to become this major litmus test of who you trusted. Did you trust the science, the authorities, or did you distrust the rules, question the motives?
It became very divisive.
Extremely. And just the general fear and uncertainty that inherently reduces trust. People became warier of strangers. Someone coughing nearby suddenly felt alarming. And worse, the sources point to those really worrying instances of xenophobia and harassment targeting people of Asian descent or discrimination against foreign nationals based on completely misguided blame for the virus.
Which really seemed to work against that ideal of a global, cosmopolitan society dealing with a shared problem. But the sources also highlighted the inverse, right? Places with higher pre-existing trust seemed to handle it better.
That's a really key finding discussed in the sources. Countries or regions with higher social capital, higher trust, both in institutions and among people themselves, like maybe some places in Scandinavia or New Zealand, they often had more effective public health responses and, importantly, less internal strife and division over the measures.
There was data on that.
Yes. The sources cite a significant study in The Lancet from 2022. It found a strong global correlation. Greater trust in government and higher interpersonal trust were associated with significantly lower COVID-19 infection rates, up to 40% lower, potentially.
Wow, 40%. That's huge. It really underlines trust not just as a nice feeling, but as a practical, foundational element for getting through something like that.
It really suggests trust isn't just, a fuzzy concept. It's a practical necessity for collective action in a crisis. High trust makes people more willing to make personal sacrifices for the collective good, wearing masks, even if uncomfortable, staying home to protect others. When that trust collapses, compliance fragments, divisions deepen, and the whole collective effort needed to manage a huge crisis starts to fall apart.
And just the long-term feeling of it all, the prolonged fear, the uncertainty, living under emergency measures, seeing empty city streets, the constant low-level threat, the sources mention how that revealed the fragility of our normal routines. The illusion of permanence was shattered.
Yeah, that feeling that things would just carry on as normal. That experience, it can cut two ways, can't it? For some, it might breed a greater appreciation for stability, for community. For others, maybe more cynicism or anxiety.
And civility itself during that time. It felt fragile sometimes, didn't it? You saw the online vitriol, the real-world confrontations over masks.
Definitely fragile moments,
Yeah.
but also surprisingly robust in other ways. Think about the generally orderly queues for testing and vaccines, the outpouring of community aid and mutual support networks that sprang up.
So a mixed picture.
Very mixed. Prolonged fear, as the sources note, has been linked to reported increases in anxiety, maybe less desire to mingle socially for some people. It certainly forced a reevaluation of priorities for many, perhaps making some more empathetic, others maybe more guarded.
And globally, thinking bigger picture.
Well, the pandemic definitely accelerated trends like remote work and communication. That could potentially make some forms of interaction more inclusive, removing geographical barriers. It absolutely pushed discussions about mental health much more into the open, and it made existing societal inequities in healthcare access, economic impact glaringly visible.
It also forced those really tough ethical debates, didn't it? Balancing individual freedoms against collective public safety.
Huge debates. And different cultures often approach those questions with very different filters. You saw a contrast between, say, an emphasis on civic duty in parts of East Asia versus a stronger focus on individual rights being the dominant frame for things like mask mandates in some Western countries.
So civility isn't some universal constant. It gets interpreted through our cultural lenses.
Absolutely. The pandemic forced every culture to confront what civility means when maintaining physical distance suddenly becomes the ultimate sign of respect and care for others.
Which brings us right back to that core question we started with. Based on all this, is civility stable? Is it deeply rooted? Or is it ultimately just a fragile veneer?
Yeah, the big question.
And based on everything these sources have shown us, it really feels like the answer has to be nuanced, doesn't it? It seems like it's both. It can be incredibly fragile in certain moments under certain pressures, but also surprisingly resilient at other times.
I think that's right. The case for the fragile veneer, it's compelling when you look at those moments of breakdown. Freud's perspective that human aggression is always kind of lurking beneath the surface, just held in check by rules, that resonates when you look at history or even just neighbors in conflict.
That quote, often attributed to Thatcher, "The veneer of civilization is very thin."
It captures that fear perfectly, doesn't it? The fear that under extreme pressure, like intense scarcity or overwhelming fear, our most primal self-preservation instincts just take over completely. The initial chaos of the pandemic hoarding, the Black Friday melees, those moments of sheer panic and disasters, even the way anonymity seems to fuel incivility online. It all suggests those polite restraints can fall away frighteningly quickly.
But then you have that powerful counter-evidence we talked about. The sources detailing people upholding principles, caring for total strangers, even in the most desperate circumstances.
Right. Norms can reassert themselves after the initial shock, like the Titanic example suggests. The evidence of people risking their own lives for others. The arguments from thinkers like Rutger Bregman, who argues quite forcefully that kindness and decency might actually be deeply wired evolutionary traits, not just some thin overlay.
Cooperation as a survival strategy.
Exactly. The solidarity seen in so many communities during crises, the healthcare workers, the neighbors, helping neighbors, these suggest a pretty robust moral fiber exists right alongside those darker impulses. It's not just a veneer.
So maybe it depends heavily on the context and how prepared we are.
That seems crucial. The sources strongly indicate that context and preparedness play a massive role. Things like strong, stable institutions, a sense of fairness in how resources are distributed, high levels of pre-existing trust. These seem to create the conditions where our better angels, as Lincoln put it, are more likely to prevail.
If people believe the system is basically fair and that most others will do their part,
Then panic and purely selfish behavior are less likely to take hold. Clear communication, strong, trustworthy leadership in a crisis, these things can sustain that belief and bolster civility. Conversely, institutional failure, confusing or contradictory messages that erodes trust and absolutely amplifies fear and competition.
so it's not like a switch, either we're civilized or we're not. It sounds more like a dynamic tension. Human nature contains both capacities for incredible selfishness and for amazing altruism.
I think that's a good way to put it. And civilization itself, with its norms, its laws, its shared values.
Yeah.
Maybe it isn't a finished structure, something we achieve and then just have. Maybe it's more like an ongoing project.
That project, how do you mean?
An ongoing collective effort to actively nurture those cooperative pro-social instincts and to develop ways to contain the destructive ones. Remember Schweitzer's idea of ethical civilization. It requires constant attention, constant renewal.
So crises aren't just moments where a pre-existing thing, the veneer, gets tested.
Maybe not just that. They're also tests of our commitment to that ongoing project. They can absolutely reveal weaknesses. They can scrape off the polite surface, show the ugliness underneath. But they can also, paradoxically, temper and strengthen the underlying moral core, like, steel being hardened by fire.
Okay, so Wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you listening in? This deep dive into your sources, it really shows how our understanding of civilization has evolved. It started with complex societies, but grew to include this whole code of conduct, civility,
Hmm.
and these stress tests we've looked at, from bizarre toilet paper panic to profound disasters. And of course, the global pandemic, they reveal that civility. Well, it isn't a guaranteed state we live in, but nor is it a complete illusion. It feels more like a practice.
Something we do actively.
Yeah, we saw moments where the social contract frayed pretty dramatically, didn't we? But we also saw incredibly powerful moments that reaffirmed faith in human kindness, in our capacity for cooperation. And the whole experience, it leaves us and leaves you with a really crucial question, I think. How do we actively cultivate and strengthen those virtues of civilization? Things like empathy, cooperation, trust. How do we build those up now so that when the next inevitable crisis arrives, because there will be one, our capacity for pro-social behavior, our better angels, have the strongest possible chance against our more primal fears and instincts?
Yeah. How do we prepare that foundation?
Exactly. In the end, the sources seem to suggest that civilization might be best understood not as a static veneer or some unbreakable fortress, but as this really delicate, dynamic balance, a collective human effort that's simultaneously fragile and resilient.
A constant balancing act.
Feels like it. The pandemic, maybe more than any event in recent memory, served as this stark reminder.
Yeah.
We really do depend on each other. We depend on those bonds of civility and trust to maintain that balance. We have to be conscious, deliberate, and preserving and strengthening them, come what may.
Definitely something to think about.
Something to think about as you go about your day.